So did you ever notice that when you're listening at home at a bedroom volume or an office volume or with headphones, and you dial in a guitar sound, then you bring that same tone or that same sound into a louder situation, like playing with a drummer or in a band or in a rehearsal studio where you can really crank the volume, that they sound very, very different. There's a reason for that, and it has to do with perceptual psychology. So in this video, we're actually going to talk about building patches on a Line 6 helix. But this works with pretty much anything, an amp, modelers, you name it. And how we use what we know about human hearing and psychology in order to dial in tones that'll work in any situation. All right, so let's go onto the computer and see what we've got.
So what I want to do here is really just take it down to our equipment. I mean, know your gear, right? And the most important piece of gear that we have is our ears. And the physiology of the ear explains a lot of the stuff that we experience as guitarists. And the most important parts of the ear, or the most important part, is this guy right here. And let's see if we can get to it. Right here. It's this curly little device called the cochlea, and that's the hearing canal. And really what's happening is sound kind of gets funneled in here, comes through this tube, hits the eardrum, vibrates around in here, and it vibrates a fluid in this cochlea. And when that fluid vibrates, these little hairs get excited, and it's the excitement of those little hairs that actually creates our perception of sound. And of course, this nerve right here takes all that information to the brain where it's processed. And just like any good multi-effect or something like that, the input, the quality of the input, the AD converter, so to speak, which is right here, and then the processing are all really important to understanding what your tone's going to sound like. So this is actually what that cochlea looks like. Okay, so it's a tube, and it's curled. The beginning is thicker and the end is smaller. And what's really happening here is that there's hairs lining this whole kind of spiral here. And those hairs are receptive to different frequencies at different parts of the curve. And what you see is that the really high tones, say 20,000, all the way up to, say, about 5,000, are right in the beginning. It also just so happens that the hairs here are most susceptible to hearing damage because it's coming in here most energetic and being subject to noises, say, above 80 decibels, 85 decibels, which isn't that loud. Over the course of a lifetime, the little hairs start dying out, and we start being less attuned to the sounds in this high range. Then you'll notice a really, really big section starting around here. These are the mids. And we said in a prior video that the mids are perceived at lower volumes, and the mids are actually perceived as louder than highs and lows at most volumes. Well, that's because most of our cochlea is dedicated to the midtones. Look at all this real estate that they have. So when we're talking about Fletcher Munson curves or our amps sounding different at low volumes and high volumes, also that mids cut through the mix. Biology has a reason for that. Most of this cochlea is dedicated to hearing the mids, and then you have your lows. See, that 200 is here. Everything under 200 is this tiny, tiny, tiny little piece. So we barely hear tones under 200 unless they're very, very loud, because it's got to make its way through this entire tunnel and get there. So there's the equipment that we're working with. Just kind of go into a highlighter here. This entryway is where the highs are. It's the most susceptible to damage, and it's kind of at the entryway, the beginning of where the sound comes in. The lows are also a small area right over here. It's a small area at the end of the tunnel, and the sound's got to be pretty darn loud for you to perceive that. And of course, the middle tones is most of this cochlea, or our hearing equipment. This is where human speech is. We're just more attuned to human speech. That's kind of an evolutionary adaptation that we have. We want to hear other people. We're a communicative species, right? So now that we know that the mids have the most equipment and the most real estate, that the highs are most susceptible to damage, and that the lows require a hell of a lot of energy for us to hear it, we can kind of figure out what's going on with different things that we perceive. Anybody ever perceive or experience what we call cotton ear? And that's when, like, you're at a loud concert or you're playing really loud, and then maybe for a couple hours or even a day, everything sounds muffled. Well, the reason for that is you naturally have a response to protect this really, really valuable area of your hearing right in here in the highs. So you'll actually have a response of the body to kind of like, I'm going to oversimplify this, to coat those hairs with a protective kind of gunk so they can't be damaged by very, very loud sounds. And so you're actually hearing the effects of those hairs being overtired and protected, and it sounds like cotton ear because you're getting no high tones. Playing the guitar for a long period of time creates ear fatigue because the neurons or the nerve cells that are connected to all these hairs get tired out. So our actual perception of the sound will change dramatically when exposed to prolonged listening. So if you're going to be building your tones, you really, really, really need to be doing so with fresh ears. If you're an hour into a playing session and you're creating tones and then you play them again, they're going to sound very, very different. Now, this is another kind of piece of our physiology that will help us understand Fletcher Munson curves. The way that our equipment is wired up with nerves is that there's different kinds of nerves connected to these hair cells. So these are the hair cells, and when there's a sound wave hitting them, they vibrate back and forth, and it's stimulating these nerve cells. And the different nerve cells, there's 3 different kinds, are kind of attuned to different volumes or strengths of signal that makes them fire. So you have tons and tons of these little hairs and tons of nerves connected to those little hairs. And the way that we perceive loudness is that we kind of add up the firings of these little nerves. So this is what we'll call a soft sound, and this is like a really loud sound. And what you see is with the soft sound, you get almost no firings at all of the type 2 and type 3 neurons, but you get tons of firing of type 1. A little bit of firing of type 1. So down here you kind of have how many firings are being detected. Not a lot. All the way up here, all the different nerves are firing at a pretty good rate, and as we're collecting signal, we're getting a lot more signal, so we perceive it as being louder. Well, this kind of explains what's happening with the Fletcher Munson effect, where at low volumes, right, we don't have a lot of low tones that we can hear at all because A, there's not a lot of real estate, and B, there's not a lot of stimulation of them because the sound isn't necessarily making it all the way to the end. The high tones are suppressed a little bit because these type 2 and 3 neurons aren't really firing, so we're just not collecting a whole lot of signals for low volume. And the mids are still pretty strong because we have tons and tons of real estate. So this is low volume. We have tons and tons of real estate dedicated to detecting those, so we're going to be detecting a lot more activity. Now at high volume, what's happening is that the lows and the highs catch up. So at high volume, you start to get a lot more signals with the lows and the highs, and we start to perceive them more strongly. So it's really our equipment itself is determining the perceived volume of a particular signal. It's very important to recognize that the perceived volume of the signal and the actual volume are very, very different. This is why it's almost impossible to volume adjust patches so they all sound about the same volume. Because if you look at actual volume or decibels, and you make all of the patches kind of equal decibels, they're still going to sound all different. And then if you're using a humbucker, which has kind of got a big mid push, or a Strat, which has a mid scoop, they're going to be perceived at different volumes as well. Or if one patch has a tube screamer, which has a mid hump, it's going to sound a little bit louder, even if it's at the same decibels as a scoopier patch. So kind of volume regulating patches is a very, very, very difficult thing to do. So the last thing before we go to Fletcher Munson curves, which is the last part, and then a demo, we've got to talk about the difference between sound pressure levels measured in decibels, which is a decibel is a measurement of actual pressure over a certain area. And so sound is actually creating pressure. It's what makes our eardrum kind of boom, 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 go back and forth. This is a measurement that's objective. It's linear, right? A little more pressure makes decibels go up. For every 10 decibels or so, we actually perceive loudness about twice as much. So the difference between 50 decibels and 60 decibels is that this sound seems about twice as loud to us. So think about the difference between 60 and 100. 60 to 70, twice as loud. 70 to 80, twice as loud yet again. 80 to 90, twice as loud yet again. So the difference between 60 and 100 is huge. The difference between 60 and 100 is loud conversation versus, a guitar amp at full volume. Sound pressure level and perceptive loudness is very, very different. Loudness is how we perceive the volume. So a low tone, say 100 hertz, 100 cycles per second, at 60 decibels is almost impossible to hear. At 100 decibels, it's perceived pretty well. So even though you're just going up in certain increments of decibels, our ears kind of change to the sensitivity at different frequencies. So loudness is a physiology thing. Loudness is how our bodies, I'm going to spell that wrong. It's how our bodies deal with the sound pressure levels at different frequencies. So this is something that can be gamed, right? If you've had a lifetime of loud music, you're going to perceive loudness at different frequencies different than a kid does. That's why you see a lot of kids wearing headphones or sound protective gear at concerts. They have their full frequency of hearing and are much, much more susceptible for damage, whereas, older guys tend to have screwed up their hearing already much earlier in life. And it's frequency, and this is an important part, frequency, QU, specific. It changes with time. With exposure, changes with over the lifetime of hearing loss. It changes with volume. And it also changes with the mix of tones that you're hearing. Guitar is not a pure tone. All of the data and studies that we have about loudness, like the Fletcher Munson studies, are actually done with pure tones, just a single frequency. But we know that music and guitar sounds is a mix of different frequencies, and hearing multiple frequencies at the same time actually changes things a little bit. For that reason, all of that Fletcher Munson data and all the stuff that we use to kind of figure out what's going on doesn't actually apply 100%. It's a really, really complex issue. So the takeaways here are that our equipment explains a lot of the stuff that's happening to us, like ear fatigue, like cotton ear, like the difference of tone at loud or soft volumes, like the difference in how we perceive mids as louder than lows and highs, all have to do with the gear that we have installed and the digital to analog converter in our heads and the processing done in our brains. Actual volume, right, measured in decibels, doesn't necessarily translate to loudness. There's a lot of things that are in play, including how bad your hearing is, what frequencies you're listening to, how long you've been listening to them, and the volume that they're played at. So that's kind of the physiology lesson behind the whole Fletcher Munson thing. Let's go ahead and now look at those studies and what they tell us about guitar tone. Okay, so now that we learned kind of what's going on with our equipment, I'm going to use this Photoshop thing here to go through Fletcher Munson and how it affects guitar tone. I'm trying to like oversimplify certain things, so you can certainly call me out for stuff that I'm not being 100% precise in my language, so so be it. I'm just learning this just like everybody else. All right. What happens? Sorry about that. What happens at different frequencies? We're looking at one equal loudness curve. All right. Equal loudness curve means everything on this line is going to be perceived at the same loudness to us. So every frequency from 20 to 50, 100, 200, all the way up to, just over 10K is going to be perceived as the same loudness. And if our ears had the same response to every single frequency, then this curve would be flat. But obviously it isn't flat. And what we're seeing is that, okay, so this is 50, 60, 70 decibels, okay? What we're seeing is that this is kind of right at 50 decibels right here, okay? Right there. So something between 1,000 and 2,000 hertz, here's our frequencies, at 50 decibels is going to sound what they made up this thing called a phone, all right, which is a unit of loudness. Okay, so right there at 1,500 hertz, something at 50 decibels of actual volume is going to be perceived at 50 phones of loudness. And so this is going to be kind of like the home base for our curve. Now let's go all the way down to 20 hertz, okay? For a frequency at 20 hertz to be perceived just the same loudness, 50 phones, we're going to have to get it up to 60, 70, 80, 90, close to 100 decibels. Now, 20 hertz is not important to guitar tone. So we don't really adjust our patches to make everything equal loudness. We really do want our guitar tones to have a natural mid-bump, just like our hearing does. So equal loudness of every frequency is not the goal here. But this at least teaches us kind of what's going on with our hearing. You need nearly a 51, 2, 3, 4, 5, nearly a 50 decibel boost at 20 decibels in order for something to be as loud as a tone at 1,500. Okay? Now, all the way here by 4,000 and down in the 500 to 750 range, you'll notice that the curve is below this 50 decibel line. That means that these frequencies we're even more sensitive to, all right? And so you need maybe a 5 to 10 decibel dip in order for those frequencies to be perceived the same loudness as 1500. From a biology standpoint, this is where our vowels are when we're speaking in general, and this is where the kind of consonants and sibilances are. And so there's kind of this little hump here. That's kind of the explanation for that. Not important, but what is important to know is that from an equal loudness standpoint, you would need to kind of give yourself a little bit of a dip in the EQ between 2,000 and 5,000, a little dip in the EQ around 500 to 750, and all the way up in the highs, you're going to need to boost them again once you start to get over, say, 6,000 hertz or 6K. So you would need a little boost here for equal loudness. But again, as we said, equal loudness is not the goal. This one equal loudness curve, though, is just for 50 phone of loudness or perceived loudness. And that's like, light conversation in the office, not whispering, not loud. All right, 60 decibels is kind of bedroom playing volume if you're not playing loud. So bedroom listening is around 60 decibels, and that would be at, say, 50 phone at 1500 hertz. So let's look at the actual Fletcher Munson curves. You can get a feeling for what everything means now. Here it is. So here we have our sound pressure levels, and here we have all of our equal loudness curves, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 phone, all the way up to 120. This is what's interesting. This is the one we just saw. So this is the curve that we just looked at. Let's make this red so it's easier to see. Okay. What you'll notice is that the shape of these curves up at 100 or 110 is different than the shape of these curves around 40, 50, and 60. It's these differences that explain the differences in how we hear things at high volume and lower volumes. 30, 40 in this range, this is whisper quiet. This is baby sleeping in the room volumes. And you can see here at 30 and 40, you need like a bajillion decibel boost in the lows. And even at 100, which musically is important, you're still looking at 20, even 30 decibel boosts required. So when you're listening things whisper quiet, it's almost impossible to get good bass. And you're also seeing a really big hump, 10 decibels, that's required in the highs around 8K and above, which are also musically important. It kind of gives air and life. And you find yourself kind of cranking the treble so you can hear those frequencies at lower volumes. But once you get all the way up here to, say, 100 decibels and 100 phone, you only need tiny, tiny little boosts in comparison in the trebles. So if you're creating a tone at whisper volume and you crank the treble to make it sound good, and then you play the same tone at a very high volume, it's going to be incredibly shrill. Everything kind of like here and above, this is like 9K and above. That's really, really top air, and it's not terribly musically important to get those right. So in order to fix the problem of creating a patch at a low volume and playing at a high volume, what I've done is I've looked at 60 and 100, because this is the difference between kind of bedroom playing and playing in a louder situation like gig volume. And when you look at just those two curves, what you got to do is put them one on top of another. Let's see if we can get that done. So here we have them one on top of another. Let's create a new layer so I can draw on it for you. What's important here is not the curve itself, but the difference between the two curves. All right? So this is bedroom, and this here is gig volume. Let's assume we're playing at a low volume, okay? And we create a patch that sounds good to us. Okay, so we can assume that everything on this blue curve sounds really good and natural. But what's going to happen is the differences in our sound or hearing response at high volumes is going to create some problems for us. So what I want to do is understand what is the difference between the top curve and the bottom curve. So going from bedroom to gig, you're looking at maybe a 20 decibel difference all the way down in the sub lows. So this is like give or take 60. Okay, so let's call this 64. Needs a really big drop. Down by 100, you're looking at maybe a 10 decibel drop that you need. Okay, now you're starting to get to between 500 and 1500. You really don't need much of a difference. Maybe a little bit around 500 hertz. Maybe, 1 or 2 decibels. And now, as you get into the highs, you're seeing additional little boosts or drops required to make the trebles sound right. This is why you see a lot of people saying, hey, just put some top cut into your patch if you want to play it at top volume. So when you're gigging, cut the highs a little bit. My suggestion is rather than killing all the highs, why don't you just suppress them by the amount explained by the differences in these curves. So what have we learned? We learned what an equal loudness curve is, and that equal loudness curves at different volumes are perceived differently, and that the difference between these curves is really what accounts for the differences in what you're hearing between low volume and high volume playing. In order to compensate for this, what I've done is I've created a 10-band EQ. 10-band EQ. That's a Q. Just go with it. That calculates and accounts for the actual differences in these curves from the Fletcher Munson study. Couple things to think about here. Fletcher and Munson aren't the only people that did this in the past. There are other curves. For example, in red here is what we call ISO 226. There's been other studies as well. So there's no perfect way to do this. As well, the lows are not necessarily musically important. As we're playing very loud at gig volumes, we tend to have other instruments. So I didn't boost the lows quite as much just for that reason, just because you want the guitar to sit in the mix well as you go to higher volumes. So let's go ahead into the Helix app and take a look at those. Okay, here we are, and this is a app that's just a utility. It's EQs that you can copy, right-click, copy the block, and paste into other patches. The second video will actually be about how to apply this and use it, but I want to give you an idea of what we've done. It goes at the end, so if you've applied low cuts or high cuts, those will be accounted for. But what you're seeing here is way down at 30 hertz, which is the sub lows. We boosted it as much as possible. In reality, you need like a 20 or 30 decibel boost in order to have an equal loudness. So we're assuming that we're playing at low kind of volume, 60 decibels, which is kind of conversational, and we want the patch to sound good at a high volume. So what we're doing is we're making the low volume sound approximate or mimic what the high volume sound might be like. So you're seeing these big boosts in the lows, 30, 62, plus 10, 125, plus 9. And then as you get higher and higher towards 500, 1K, 2K, you're seeing very minimal differences. 500 is just a decibel, 1,000 is flat, and then 2K and 4K you're getting little boosts, 8K and 16K you're getting larger boosts. Now this will make the overall sound louder because you're boosting a whole bunch of frequencies, so it's going to make the whole thing sound louder. So what I've done is actually reduced the whole level by a couple decibels. But this is something that you can tweak for your own speakers, for your own, if you're doing 4-cable method, it'll be different. If you're using a full range speaker, it'll be different. But in video 2, part 2 of this, will actually talk about applying these curves. But what you're seeing here is the differences between 60 and 100 decibels in the Fletcher Munson curves. And that's what we just did in the video. So this was the boring science video. I hope this gives you some perspective as to why certain things happen to us when we're listening. And we'll move on to the second video and listen to some guitar sounds. Until then, happy playing, take care of each other, and sweet guitaring. Take care now. Bye.